Hello everyone, welcome back to Sprint 2 of React Developer Log. In this sprint, on top of building the joiners page, we will do some housekeeping in terms of project management, such as backlog refinement and reorganizing our project folder so that it aligns to clean coding principle. Without further ado, let's jump into our first agenda item, which is the backlog refinement. In Agile Scrum methodology, system requirements are written as user story. These user story are then placed in a list called the product backlog, and it will be grouped and prioritized for development for a specific sprint. The diagram on our right is a sample product backlog. As we can see, each cell contains of a user story, and each user story is colored based on the sprint that is prioritized for. In our cell that we are looking at, the first few cells, the payment gateway is prioritized together as the same sprint with the login page and user authentication user story. While if you look further down, the user database is prioritized together with the menu page and menu item database user story. In a way, there is some misprioritization, because if we think of it this way, if we want to ensure authentication is working, how could we do so without the user database? That is why we want to take out both the user story, swap it and reprioritize its order, and upon doing so, it is ready to go to sprint 1 for development. Do note that every sprint will clear the product backlog, and it will make the list shorter and shorter. As you can see here, after sprint 1, there will only be 6 user stories remaining out of the 9 initial user stories. There's another takeaway message here that I would like to emphasize, is that this product backlog is not cast in stone. As the name Agile methodology, Agile means that things are always agile, and this also applies to the product backlog. That's why it's really normal for user story to be not prioritized properly to the particular sprint at the start. And as the name goes, we are agile, so this product backlog will be frequently reviewed and reprioritized. That's why it's okay to do so. So change is always a constant, and this applies to the product backlog. To recap, back in Sprint 0, I mentioned briefly of the team behind this project. So now I'm going to share a bit more. All members of this team are actually volunteers, and they are serving in designated roles such as designers, UI UX designers, business analysis, and for me, the one and only developer in the team. So the Agile methodology we're seeing now is actually an adapted form for a one-man developer team, and thus the user story is not in the conventional documentation form of a Word or Excel document, but it existed in the form of a wireframe, which is actually okay, because in my view, Agile methodology is meant to value add and not there for ceremonial purposes to make work honorarious, slowing the process. It's meant to really value add. So I believe that what we should do is just to take the best of it and apply it. Back to our backlog refinement. In our original sprint schedule, there are actually 5 sprints. The text in bold is where we are currently at. The workload or story point in sprint 2, in my view, is pretty heavy. So on review, I decided to break down sprint 2 into more sprints. So as you can see here in the revised sprint schedule, the contact us will go into the next spring. And I also further define spring 2, and instead of having just a joiners page, I also specified that we're setting up the database for the volunteer sign up. Likewise, for the store directory in spring 3 of the initial spring, when you translate over into the revised spring schedule, I'm not only doing the store directory, I'm also doing the store database. Similarly, spring 3 has quite a pretty heavy story point. That's why I decided to split it into 2 sprints. Spring 4 will do the store directory and store database, and spring 5 will do the specific store page for every store. After that, after spring 5, in spring 6, we will do some touching up to make sure that it looks perfect in mobile. And last but not least, we will host it in cloud. That's all for our first agenda item. Now let's go to the next agenda item, which is the project folder organization. Before we start, we need to understand that clean code goes beyond the code itself. It also applies to how we organize the code. In other words, the file that is containing the codes. Are we actually organizing it by type or by functions? Are we descriptive enough with the file names so that many years down the road, when we revisit our project, can us or even others developer be able to understand and pick up the code so that it can do further enhancement? That is why that's why we decided to reorganize our project folder to make it easier to understand. So in the screenshot below, we have our original project directory. There isn't much organization to it because in the earlier spring, we do not have much content or in it. But however, as we move on to this spring and further springs, there will be more and more pages, more and more components. That is why we are going to reorganize it into this format. As you can see, the revised folder directory. Not much differences, 3 or 4 differences, and I'll go through them now. First off, there is a new folder called the image folder to store image instead of storing the public folder. Second, the component folder will no longer store pages. Instead, it will store recyclable independent parts such as button, footers, navbar, tooltips, etc. There will also be a new folder called pages to store page. And last but not least, there will be a service folder to store all the middlewares, or what we call it, helpers, controller, or models. More will be covered of it in further springs, and there's one helper method we will cover in these springs. Okay, so that's pretty fast. We have done 2 agenda items and we have done all the housekeeping. So let's start the real fun, which is to delve in to the construction of the joiners page. Before we start, let's take a look at the wireframe of the joiners page on the right. This page is actually made up of 3 rows. The first 2 rows are actually pretty similar because you have a transparent background image and text in front that is not so transparent. So let's start with the first row. What we see here is what has been transferred over from the previous slide, the wireframe. So what we will do is to continue to use Bootstrap grid system to continue to structure and the content, structure and section the content. So from the wireframe below, we can see that we can actually subdivide the first row into 3 rows. The code on the right will show how we do that, the proportion 4, 3, 5. So you can see it's in the proportion of 4, 3, 5. And after sectioning, we want to ensure that these content are vertically aligned in the center. So we do that by setting the CSS property of align item to be center. With that set up, it's now time to insert the background image to our folders. And to do so, we will put it in the subfolder called photo of the public folder. As you can see, we will first insert the div tag element, and we set this div, the background image, to be of this image. Another thing to mention is that this image is actually, you can see it's actually pretty dark, not so transparent. I want to make it transparent later on, and we cover that in further slide. But one more thing to mention is that we want this image to not be repeated in all the columns. We want it to stretch across the column. So we set the CSS properties background size to be covered so that it will not repeat, it will stretch across. One more thing to mention is this background image, as you can see here, it will not appear if you set this code without this height, because there's no content inside and this image is meant to fit it. And if you do not specify the height, this div will collapse. So it's important to specify the height first, then you can see the image. Okay, last but not least, after we have structured the content, then insert this image as the background. So you can see we now want to make this image to be transparent. That's why we have initially set up to do so. And to do so, if we could adjust the opacity to be 0.3, so it'll be less transparent. But if you set it to be 0.3, the text itself, which is the content itself, will also be 0.3. That's something that we do not want. So the workaround is to actually cheat with pre-editing the transparency with photo editing software such as Photoshop or PowerPoint slides. PowerPoint, which is what I do. As you can see here, under picture format correction, I'm able to adjust the transparency. Then I export the slide containing the background image to be saved in JPG, and after that transfer into all the way back into this folder all the way back to this folder, public photo folder. So it's quite tedious. Okay, so after doing that, let's look at the actual product. And this is what we get. We have a transparent background, section into 3 different columns, and first what we do is we section it. We have this content, we section it, then we put the background image, then we make the background image. This background image was pre-edited to be transparent, and this is the effect, how it looks like. Okay, so we are done with the first row. What we're going to do now is the second row, which is similar, but we are going to adopt a different approach to it. So previously for our first row, the background image is imported to the public folder and was referenced through JSX in the join_us.js file. So now for our second row, we are now going to insert it with a different method. We are not going to use JSX, we are going to use CSS. So that's the difference. You can see from the code compared to the first one. You put it in a div, then you set it as background image. Now we want to use CSS style sheet to specify the background image. So it's an external CSS file to be precise in the root folder. However, to do so, we could not store this image in the public folder. We'll get this error message of relative import outside of source are not supported. And this is because this CSS folder is stored in the source folder, while this image is stored in the photo folder in the public folder. And there's two different parent folder. And what I read from the online community is that React does not support two parent folder. So the only way out is to actually store it inside the source folder. That's why when you see I reorganize the folder, I have an image folder particularly for it. So previously, after inserting the image, what we try to do is to make the background image transparent. However, in our earlier methods, what we do is we pre-edit it with a photo editing software or PowerPoint slide. But now we want to do it with CSS. Okay, before we continue first, let's take a look at this, our first row. If you notice, our first row image is still not that transparent. The text still is a bit hard to read. So if we want to edit the transparency on the fly, it's not possible to do so because we need to re-edit it again, save it and import it. That is why I'm going ahead with this method of editing the transparency with CSS so that we can edit the opacity on the fly whenever we need without going through this tedious process. So first off, let's talk about the HTML code. Pretty simple. We have this row as our container and we have a span. If you notice, this span will contain not only the background, but it will also contain, it will contain the background and it will also contain the text, which is the header, paragraph, tag element. So it will contain a div that contains a text, to be precise, here. So you can see it here. Okay, so after showing you the HTML code, I put it here just for reference. Next, we will talk about the CSS code and show you how do we actually edit the transparency of the background without making the text transparent. We want to keep the text fully opaque. So to do so, if you notice, this join_us spam tool, this is the purpose of it. It's serving as the overall container for the content itself. This is an overall container, and this chunk is talking about the content container. And you see, before this chunk, there's something before that. Okay, so Okay. So after walking you through the CSS code, brief overview, let's show how do we actually segment this background for the image. First off, we need to make sure the overall container has a flex display, and this div2 position is set to absolute. Then we will use this before pseudo element to insert the background image before the content itself. This content is actually the span. This is actually the div. And oops, some typo here. It should be span. And we also need to make sure the position is relative to it. This way, the container will be separated. As you can see in the z-axis, you can see here. And if it's separated, when we adjust the opacity, this will not be affected, but this will be affected. Okay, so we have shown the secret formula behind making the background image transparent but while retaining the opacity of the text. Before we move on to the third row, I will also want to mention that this background image will collapse if we do not set the width and height. And also we want it to fill the screen, that's why we make sure that the margin is clear. So these minor points. Okay, so usual practice, after showing you the code, the thing is we will always go back to the actual product to show how it looks like, and this is the actual product. And this time around, the text is opaque, this thing is transparent, and if we feel that the background image is not transparent enough, we can just simply go back to the CSS code, change it from 0.3 to 0.1, and it's done. We do not have to go through a process of pre-editing everything again and re-upload. Okay, so this brings us to the last row, which is the most fun row. It's actually, if you look at it, it's actually a volunteer sign up form. As the title already suggests, interested in joining us, and you have form data here. You have a few form field, and you have submit buttons. So before we proceed to the actual walkthrough of the development, let's review the user story first. The purpose for this form is for volunteers to indicate their interest, and not only that, we want the admin to contact the volunteers and engage them. So from the wireframe, what you can derive, the requirement is that there is fields for user to input and a submit button for them to submit the thing. And one last thing is that is a given is form validation, meaning that we want the form to reflect error message whenever invalid data is keyed. Otherwise, if there's no validation, we'll end up with a lot of invalid data, and this will not be helpful to the admin itself. What we want to do now is also to put ourselves in the shoe of the admin who happen to be a volunteer. So being a volunteer, we do not expect them to use their mobile or personal resource to contact the sign-up if necessary. Hence, we want them to be able to use their email address or a public the email address that's set up for them to contact the volunteer sign up. That's why we want this volunteer sign up. So you can see here in the proposed design, we want to have an additional field called email address for volunteer sign up to list down their email address. Also, we want to propose to implement timestamps so that the volunteer sign up could be easily sorted and searched when necessary. And also we want to have a volunteer status so that whenever admin have engaged the volunteer, they will be able to track when they have closed the loop. And we also need to take note that there's not only one admin, there's many admin. So how do we know which volunteer has been engaged? And over time, it will also be an issue if there's no volunteer status. Last but not least, we want to include area of interest so that we could streamline the process of directing the sign up to the correct team members. Okay, so with the business perspective being briefed through, now let's talk about the tech perspective, which is the approach we use to build the form. We're going to build this form and we're going to use Formik instead of HTML and vanilla.js. I will share more of how we do it with HTML and vanilla.js just for learning purposes. Next, we'll also be using another open source library called Yap to do form validation. And last but not least, we will set up a database to store the volunteer sign up in Google's Firebase Firestore. Do note that this Google Firestore is actually NoSQL database. Okay, so just now I mentioned that I want to show you how to build a form with HTML and vanilla.js just for educational purposes. So here we are. To do so, the backbone of it is actually using the form tag, and you can see within the form tag there's label, input, and button fields, button tags. So what this label do is actually to have to, in the physical form, in the online form itself, you can actually see beside the input field, and the input is actually for the input field for the user to key, and the button is, like its name suggests, is the button for user to press. And in this case, this button is for submission purposes. And we try to keep the, so what we want to do, what this translate over is just a very basic form containing the name, email address, and the submit button. Our previous code does not have the name, but the logic to doing it is pretty similar. As you can see here, where my mouse is pointing at the code, there is this is how we do it. We insert an unnamed field. What we now aim to do after having this is, when we press the submit button, we want to transfer this value over to alert window. And to do so, we want to extract this value from the input field by referencing to HTML DOM using JQuery. Yes, I know that alternatively, there is another way to reference to HTML DOM, and that is to use the document.getElementById model. And I will not want to delve so much into why the pros and cons of the jQuery over this document.getElementById method, but what I will say, why I choose jQuery is because there's lesser text to use. I do not have to retype document.getElementById. As you can see, how to reference is just to put a money sign and bracket the selector. If you put a hash, it will reference the ID. It will be an ID selector. So as you can see here, I hash name, so I reference to this input field, and I do not use a text. I use dot value to draw out the value. And as we go through the code, you can also see that on submit, when you click submit, we will bring up alert window with this value inside. So I hope this explanation of the code is clear. Next, before I move on further, this is the code, and I would like to remind you all to please remember to import the JQuery library or module so that your JQuery will work. Otherwise, if you do not import this JQuery way of referencing the HTML DOM will not work. Okay, we are done with this educational of HTML vanilla JS thing. Would like to highlight that when it comes to React, things work a bit different, especially with forms. For example, first off, React use hook to get value from the input field, the onChange hook, and this value in the input field are actually saved in state whenever the user keys something. Last but not least, this form validation will involve passing this state to the validation component in the form of props. And all this seems very tedious. That's why I decided to use an open source library called Formik to help me handle and maintain my user input in the form of a state from start to end, which is input, validate, and submission. I will also, through Formik, be able to tap on their centralized helper method to handle form value, to do submission, and to do validations. Okay, so to do so, to use Formik, we need to install it with Node.js. This is the command below. And of course, life is not so simple. Even when we have decided to use Formik, we still are left with one important decision to decide, which is to use this useFormik hook or the Formik component. I will show you both ways, and I'll show which is my preferred way in the next few slides. Okay, let's start off with the useFormik hook. This useFormik hook is actually a custom React hook. So the code is on the right. So as you can see, this useFormik hook is actually the default method to start with, because the tutorial in the official documentation use it. So as I mentioned, this is a custom React hook, and when we use it, we have to remember to import the useFormik function from the Formik module. So this value will be written in the form of the Formik state, as you can see here. Formik state called values, and we use the onSubmit helper method to handle this submit function of the submit button. And when we want to reference it, we could reference it by keying in the Formik dot handle change dot xx value dot name. One thing to note is that useFormik is a hook and does not have a React context, and hence it will not work with other Formik components such as the field and error message. And for that reason, I'm not using it in this project. Okay, so this leaves us with Formik components, and as I mentioned, Formik components work with other components. That is the prime reason why we're using it. So as you can see here, what we use to do our form is we here have a Formik. We'll declare the thing here, Formik, and we have a Formik container to contain the field, error message, and we have this submit button here. So what I would like to share on this Formik component is that this field is the equivalent to your input field. This error message is actually a container for message that will appear if below this field, if the input data is invalid. So as usual, I have this button, and here is just some default settings such as the initial value and how you handle the onSubmit function here. We will delve more into this if you just take notice of these app volunteer methods. Before we proceed further, I think it's just worth mentioning that there's different variation of fields. These are the variation. The default is of course text field. We also have text area, which is just multiple lines of this text field. The third will be drop down, and the fourth will be just a custom React component that you can customize. I will be showing the code below will actually show the drop down because it's a bit more complicated. How we set it as drop down is actually adjusting the SAS property. If select is text area, if it's drop down, if it's select is drop down, if it's text area, it will be text area. There's some typo here, just treat it as drop down. Later we look at the actual code, then we can see what it really is. And when we press this drop down, these are the options that will appear. Okay, so with that said, let's look at the actual product first. You can see when we press the drop down, all the options with text does appear. As promised, we'll look at the code first. So this is the code. This is the finalized code. I see. So select will give you drop down. How about text area? Yeah, you just need to mention text area. Okay, so let's go back to the slide. So what we saw in our actual product, from all this code, it will translate it into this form. This is what it will look like in the actual product. But do note that this form is still not interactive yet. What do I mean? It does not have the validation function, and it does not have the submission function. So when it comes to form validation, what we want to do is to ensure that no fields are empty and the input fields are of the correct format. And for that, we are going to use Yup library, another open source project, to build our schema. To start off, we will need to insert this validation schema. And you can see here below Formik, I declare this validation schema, this joins validation schema, this constant, I will plug it in here. So this is what I mean by declaring the schema. let's take a dive into how this schema declaration. As you can see here, yup means reference to the yup help library, and this is the field. So just now earlier I mentioned that the criteria for form validation is no field are empties. So if no field are empties, we want to make all field mandatory. So we have here required, and this is the error message that will be displayed. So if the field is empty, it will display a required. We will see that when we test the product later. Beside that, so this is the point that I cover. So beside that, I want to go even deeper into the different fields to show what sort of validation they are. For name, we do not expect any numbers, so it's just alphabets. That's why it's okay to put string. For phone, it has to be numbers. So if it's not number, not integer, it will display a number only. And also do note that, just to share, in Singapore, the phone number consists of 8 numbers in length. That is why here you can see that I want to set a minimum and maximum maximum number for it. So if it's more than 8 numbers, that means it will display invalid more than 8 numbers. If it's less than, it will display this. This way of validation, this algorithm is not very clean. It's pretty crude, but let's settle it for this for now. We can refine it in further releases or sprints. Okay, so let's go to the email. In email address, yup, the reason for using yup is because it has some predefined schema, and in this case for email, I do not have to manually define the schema myself. As you can see here, if the email is invalid, this message will be displayed. We will go deeper. We will also demo how yup helps to check whether email is valid. That will be shown in the actual demo later. Excuse me. And for interest and message, nothing much, same as name. Okay, so let's go back to the actual thing. Now I say Wonder Robin. Okay, let's show the required field first. If the input field is empty, it will display a required. Type Wonder Robin. It's not empty, the message will disappear. As for this email address, note that the same goes. Empty, required, error message will come up. But if I type anything, it still detect it as invalid, because this is obviously not email address. Email address have an @ and even this, the good thing about yup is the schema is pretty more robust. You can able to detect such thing. It's only if you have a .com, then it will really as valid. But even then, we all know that d.com is not a valid thing. That's why a really good schema will be able to have some way of validating that. For example, you can store like some predefined word like after Gmail, Ymail, or some known email service provider will be able to churn out a valid, else it will be invalid. So I've demonstrated what the validation for email address. For phone, this is where the fun begins. See, if it's empty, required error message will be displayed. If I start keying in 567 and if I press 8, the less than 8 number will not appear. But if I push my luck more, I key in 9, more than 8 numbers, error message will appear. This is not what I want because I won't be able to proceed further. So I'm a developer, I'm a Wonder Robin, so I can create web app. So when I press submit, my input field will be sent over to the backend. So for now, go back to our slide first. I've demonstrated how I build a form, and after that I even show how I do form validation. I incorporate form validation into the form, and when I click submit, I want it to send the form data to the Firestore database. So you see, submit, boom, to Cloud Firestore database. And this is what I'm going to show next. Wow. Okay. To do so, first of all, we need to create a project. So you can see here, add project. After we click on the add project, we have to give it a name. And click next. This screen will show whether you need Google Analytics. For now, I don't think it's necessary. That's why I will disable it. If I disable it, it becomes step 2 out of 2. So let's go back. You see, if it's enabled, there's still a third step. I do not want it. And without further ado, I've created my project. And the next thing I want to do is to create my database. You can see the thing here, the yellow color thing here, create database. All this is from my Firebase console. So to create a database, I need to, you can either from a dashboard or from any part of your Firebase console. At the left hand side, there's a column. Okay, so click on Firestore database and you'll be brought to here. And what you want to do is to click this create database. So once you create, you'll be directed to this page. So this page is asking you whether you want to start in the test or production mode. The only difference here is in production mode, there's some restriction in the user access. So it's clear that I do not want to waste my time further to write permission. That's why I will use test mode. That's what I said earlier. And by that, this test mode will by default give you a 30 days read-write for anyone. So happen that it passed is 23rd. So just now I do encounter this error where I can't read and I can't write to it, so I have to manually set it. I can show you later. Okay, so after choosing test mode, I will jump to here. I have to choose location. I choose where it's nearest to me, and that's important because that's where all my end user are. And also we need to take note that this cloud storage bucket will be the same location as it. And in case you all don't know what a bucket is, it's just to store blob, those big objects like picture, audio, video. They are not structured. Okay, so once we are done, we enable it, boom, we have to add web app now. We have to register it in a sense to Firebase. So to do so, we need to go to project overview, click on project setting, and you'll be brought to here. what we will need to do is click on this. Because we are doing web app, if you have iOS or Android, you can also click on this. Okay, so web app please. After clicking, it will ask you to add your Firebase to web app. In a way, is to register it lah. So give it a nickname. Okay, so it will direct you to this. Okay, this is the most important thing that you need to copy. But before doing that, do ensure that in your Visual Studio you install Firebase. And after that, remember to copy it. This is where all your Firebase configuration is. Important thing is the API key. It helps to Firebase, Google to recognize that this is a legit user or legit app that's going to access this particular database. So remember, copy this. Okay. So after copying this, now time to go back to our React app, which is the Visual Studio. And what we need to do now is to do the middleware. So just now, what we have done after reorganizing the project folder, creating a service folder for this middleware, it's not for nothing. We are going to use it in this spring already. So label it Firestore helper. Okay, so for now, we will need to create a constant. What we have copied just now, we need to paste it here. And we use a constant to store it. And at the same time, we want to initialize it. So do remember to import this. And we want to fetch the database. So we need to use this, we need to import this, and we create a constant to fetch it. Okay, so I want to declare the parameter for input. So this is where we are. We declare a parameter for input. And before that, we want to add database. Okay, before that, I will want to introduce or do some basic introduction of Firebase Firestore, what it really is. This Firebase Firestore, it will first is okay. I think it's good to show you the face itself. As you can see here, your database is called collection, and each collection will contain several documents. Because it's NoSQL, you can't visualize it in a table format like a Microsoft Excel table. That will be like apple to apple for SQL. But now we are talking about NoSQL, so it's document. And if you really want to force it, I could say that this document is akin to a row in a Microsoft Excel table. That's why you can see this row will translate to several cells. So I hope that is clear to you. We go back to our slide. That's why we want to add document, and when we add document, we want to specify which collection, which database to add, which is the volunteer database. Then we need to specify the key value pairs to add. And you see just now in our earlier slide, let's go back. Let's go back. There's this add volunteer thing. We dump the Formik value into it. This is where it come in handy. Okay, go. More. Oh no. Okay. Whew, tiring. Yeah, this is where we dump our Formik.value in. So essentially what we really want to do is for this helper file is to open up or expose this add volunteer method for other components to use. That's why we export default function. And from here, when we expose, we dump the parameter in, then we can put it in here, in here, in here, in here, in here. Do not confuse this. This is the key that we define. Okay, so I've explained how we are able to add the document to that particular database using these values and this values is from Formik itself, the form that we key in the data. We'll cover that later. Okay, so we are not done yet. There's two other fields we need to include, which is the volunteer status and the timestamp. This volunteer status has a default value of open. Understandable, because when you just sign up, this thing's open. We'll try to scope out what other parameters there are for further springs. And the timestamp is like what we mentioned for future tracking and sorting. So the issue of this timestamp, as you can see, this code is pretty clean. Timestamp.now is very simple. It's actually after some try error. Initially I tried to use inbuilt server timestamp. As you can see, it's field value server timestamp, but it does not work because I'm using an add method here for add document, and how I found is from the GitHub community. Thank you very much. Love you all. So the only way out is this firebase.firestore.timestamp.now. And last but not least, please remember to import this library. Otherwise, you can't use it. Okay, so I'm down to the last slide. I already showed you how to build a helper method, how to expose it. Now we go back to the join us, which I showed you just now. I import it. I import the helper method, and when I click submit button, I will throw all this thing into my parameters, and this thing will be sent over to Cloud Firestore to be saved. Okay, so let's go to the actual product. Come on, let's go. We are at the end. Where is it? Okay. So as you can see here, let's refresh. Okay. Peter Pan. Content creation, magical touch. Okay, let's see. Yeah, Peter Pan is here. So that's all. I fully demonstrated the functionality for the join us page. Hope you find it useful, and do remember to follow and click on the subscribe button below. Thank you very much and have a great day ahead.